Peter Carey, welcome to Booktopia.
Nice to be here.
I want to cast our minds back to 1975 and find out a little bit more about you, because in 1975 you were 32, am I right? I think you were 32.
If you say so.
Yes,
yeah.
I think you were.
Yeah.
And I want to know, you were working in advertising. I want to know, how political were you in your early 30s?
Well, by the time I just arrived in Sydney, where I was working a couple of blocks from this building in North Sydney, I had just published The Fat Man in History, which I would think of as a book that continually asks political questions. But perhaps most importantly, I'd come out of the anti-Vietnam movement in Melbourne. I'd been on the Vietnam Moratorium Committee and had lived, as we lived in, a constant state of fear, paranoia and anger about the state of the world. So I think you could say that I was very, very politicized at that particular stage. I mean, there was nothing like a war where, if not you, your friends might be drafted and killed to get you very interested in politics. And so we were politicized, and we lived in a state where we wondered who the spies were, the committee, and we wondered, because it was a low-tech world, remember, if that clicking on the phone was our phone being tapped, and it probably was. And so all those paranoid things sort of turned out to be sort of mostly true in retrospect. So coming to Sydney after that time, that was sort of like who I was. I was working in an advertising agency, but my politics were of the left, and then, of course, very suspicious of American influence. It was clear to us all. The great myth was that the Vietnamese government had invited Australian troops into the conflict in Vietnam. No such thing. It may have finally happened, but for most of it, it hadn't happened. And Australia had once again put its hand up and said, please take our young men once again, sir, and we hope because of this sacrifice we're making, you will remember us later if we need your help. A naive assumption, looking at how great powers work and how real politics work, that having done a favour to a great power, you don't necessarily rely on getting anything back. So that was how it was at that time, and of course Labour had been in the wilderness for a long time, and it was exhilarating. It had been exhilarating when Gough Whitlam came to power. There was a giddy few weeks when there was no cabinet even. And Gough Whitlam and Lance Barnard sat down and made these huge decisions. And there was such a long list. But I do remember, within days, troops were being brought out of Vietnam. Our troops, our conscripts and regular soldiers were coming out of Vietnam. We recognised China. Suddenly there was more money for the arts, for tertiary education. I'm sure there was something about the working week and pay for women. Mm-hmm. There was a commitment to Aboriginal land rights and a national health scheme. And day after day after day after day, these things happened. And people who'd been away from the country, had left the country in disgust, people of the earlier generations started to come back. And it seemed like a time that we could do anything. The arts really did flourish. Literature flourished. The whole Australian literature takes off, I think, at that time. Australian theatre, which had already been very vigorous anyway, certainly was alive and well and supported. Was pretty exciting. Of course, Gough hit a world recession at that time, so it became, more difficult to enact the promises contained in what was called, I think, the platform. But they went ahead anyway, which I think as morally was the correct thing to do, although they were reviled for doing this. Great time.
Yeah,
a time of promise, a time when you dared to believe that you could have a fairer, more just, decent world, that you were not spending your time crawling around as a client state or a colonial state, whichever one it is, and that it must have been so shocking for the Americans, because you'd have Australian ministers in Parliament sort of talking about the bombing in Cambodia, talking about them as mass murderers.
Yeah.
And they had Jim Cairns, who they all thought was a communist, who actually wasn't a communist, who was trying to make capitalism work, but had a reputation as being a communist, was suddenly the deputy prime minister. I mean, they must have been freak. And the role of the Labour Party, the Labour unions in the government, I think all of this was very unappealing to our American friends.
So given the height of feeling and commitment that you have about that time, and that you experienced all of that sort of cultural renaissance, and then the sort of slamming into the dismissal, which you kind of couch very much as a US conspiracy, pointing your finger at the CIA. Why have you waited so long to vent what is obviously a very heartfelt anger about that time?
The thing that happened was that Julian Assange arrived.
A character that in a way seems to me more worthy of fiction than fact.
He's doubtless a complicated and interesting man. But I was living in the United States at a time when people in the Congress, I don't know where, but people were calling him a traitor. Mm-hmm. I thought, hang on, pal, how can he be a traitor? He's an Australian citizen. He's not an American. He can't possibly be a traitor. Did you have no curiosity about who he is and where he comes from? And it seemed to me, listening to him speak, thinking about, I think his mother had been a puppeteer in Queensland, an alternative sort of person. She'd certainly been on the left in politics, had certainly been harassed by police. I read a little thing about, in the way that many people on the left were harassed and gone through by the police for no particularly good reason. So much about him felt familiar to me, and he certainly felt very, very Australian. The Americans didn't seem, no one in the media didn't even really occur to him what that might mean. What it meant to me was, well, you were the guys that screwed us in 1975. This person actually, his mother would have gone through that. He would have grown up with all of that. So maybe, there might have been some sort of consequence for your actions. Now, I'm not so simple-minded or reductive as to think that this was the real motives of Julian Assange, a very complicated human being, for becoming the person he came and doing the things that he did. But I'm a novelist, and I started to think how interesting it would be to have someone like Assange. And at this particular stage, I had lunch with my New York publisher, Sonny Mader, at Knopf, and I'd foolishly told people about this before and been sort of a little misreported, because the way I've been reported as saying is that I was offered the opportunity to write Assange's book and I spurned it, I rejected it. It wasn't like that in the tiniest little bit. What happened was that Sonny and I had lunch. I said, I think Assange is an incredibly important figure, and this is a change in history, and the fact that he's Australian is very, very interesting to me. And we talked about that, and I talked about 75, and I talked about Lisa, and in the conversation he said, I don't suppose you want to write the book? And I said, no, of course not. And he said, no, of course not. Firstly, I don't have the skill to do it, I'm not a journalist, and like the novelist is a total control freak. The novelist controls everything on the page. The victim of a biography is fighting to control their life as it's told. This would not be a good thing for me or for him, and I didn't have the skill anyway, and this lasted a second. Unfortunately, it got onto the Twitter sphere. Continually repeated that I'd spurned him, that I'd rejected him. Nothing of the sort ever happened. However, it was the beginning of my book.
And as a writer of fiction, you took a great, I think, decision and a leap in making your whistleblower a woman. I love that about this book, I really do. Tell me about making that decision, and particularly about, I love the sort of slight provocation of her name being Gabby Bailey, because you give her a kind of blue chip Melbourne establishment name.
Well, it's a made-up name, of course. I mean, it's not her family name, really. It comes, her mother's adopted it from an American soldier and blah, blah, blah. Yes, I know. It's sort of...
It's a sly wink.
Yes, that's all it is. But it is a sly wink. Well, the first part of it, being a woman, is just very, very pragmatic. You know, I'm going to write this thing. The one thing I'm going to do is not write about Julian Assange. My first step in doing that, say, okay, I'll make her a woman. And the minute you have a hacker who's a woman, you're really beginning an interesting thing, because it's such a male sphere. The women who do write code and hack are forever dealing with a sort of a often rather adolescent male culture, and they are often truly remarkable people because of that. So that was interesting to me, you know. Anyway, and then I just had, and the things that I wanted, I wanted her to be the child of a Labour family who had experienced 1975. I decided that she would be born as the Governor General illegally dismissed. Well, he didn't. I suppose the dismissal itself was not illegal, but the crisis that produced that situation was illegal or unconstitutional. And so that was the beginning of, you know, that character, and I had to think, you know, so her character is born out of her circumstances, out of her dysfunctional family situation, which those of us who knew the, you know, families of the people of the 60s were often intensely narcissistic and dysfunctional, and children often suffered incredibly because of that.
So thinking, you know, I know that you've got two sons and that you're very concerned about the world that they're going to inherit, and rightly so, and that this fable is kind of very much sort of really written in a way for them and their generation to pay more attention to what's going on in our name, in their name. How do you feel about the issue of privacy? Because your children will have a very different notion of privacy from the one that you have. Is that something that exercises you and concerns you a lot?
Well, it exercises me a great deal, and I feel complicit, of course, in giving up my own right to privacy, because I'm lazy. Because if I want to deal with a corporation online, I will give them my name, my address, my social security number, credit cards. They'll see my buying habits. I think this is a very dangerous thing to do. We let these things go because we don't really quite believe that in our lifetime or our children's lifetime we might be living in a tyrannical state. And so all the information we sort of give because it's not going to hurt us might in the end come back to kill us.
That's quite a claim.
Well, who says what's... So, you know, and also, and the other thing about this, the whole issue of privacy, the IT people know that their life will be spent fixing bugs. They like that. You know, a code is always filled with bugs. Things don't work. And there are always weaknesses and backdoors that people can get in. And they get up the next day and they solve the problem. But if you're not somebody that has that life, it's rather worrying, because you see you could give your retinal image and your fingerprints and all of these things to the government to protect you from some horror that the government has invented. And then the government can't even protect that information because it will spill and it'll be everywhere anyway. So I think that it's a very unstable situation. Our whole banking system, I mean, what do we do if that really and it's continually threatened, continually compromised. Millions and millions of account details are hacked into by people all the time. So what happens if that's seriously compromised? That really brings down capitalism as we know it. So I do think about all of these things. But as I said, like I'm somebody who's lazy. I'm saying, this is something that we should be serious about. But I'm still buying things online.
So talking about laziness then, how do you feel, given that you are acutely political and you come from a country where voting is mandatory, how does it feel to live in a country where most people don't vote?
Well, not only do most people not vote, but that you have the right-wing interests of the country making it harder and harder for poor people to vote. And so if you're a poor black person in what state is the latest one? Ohio? I don't know. There'll be a movement to say that you have to have photo ID in order to vote, and for you to get that photo ID is expensive, difficult, time-consuming, and you're so demoralised anyway about the effects of your last vote. So they're just trying to discourage poorer people or natural democratic voters from voting. Not that I think the Democratic Party is, any sort of wild, radical, socialist alternative, but it's not quite as mad as the people who are supported by those great coal owners, the Koch brothers.
No. So, I mean, this book obviously is a big act of kind of political rage. It's an expression of great anger and frustration. I'm just wondering, though, you talked about your laziness. Is there anything that has got you out onto the street to physically march in the good old-fashioned way that people used to, and what would still get you out on the street today?
When there was a march to Wall Street during the Occupy Wall Street thing, we went, but we only went once. The brave people were the kids who time and time again made these runaway marches up Broadway to Union Square with the most threatening, bullying-looking police sort of impinging on them all the way up the road, sort of not quite exactly smashing their batons into their hand, but like that. So I've been out once or twice, not really.
I'm just wondering, finally, Peter, I mean, you've got a very wry, very sort of satirical streak. Your book, Amnesia, is very funny. It's a great romp of a read, full of hilarious set pieces and characters. But are you a or are you an optimist? I can't make up my mind.
It's good, thank you. Me neither. But I think you'd say that I'm historically pessimistic, but I always I'm pleased that you say you find the book funny. I think in dark times, humour is the life force, and it is the light, and we really, really need it. So I'm very pessimistic. I don't see any reason to be optimistic. It's still not too late for us not to destroy our habitat. But we're not going to save ourselves by shipping coal to China.
Peter Carey, thank you very much.